Hello and welcome to this self-training module, which is about working with vulnerable groups. At the end of this module, you will be able to identify vulnerable groups, get in contact with them and inform them of the services that you offer, understand how to get to know vulnerable groups and communicate and interact with them, and adapt how you reach out to and interact with vulnerable groups according to specific circumstances. For example, situations where, for whatever reason, you cannot meet in person. Please feel free to pause or rewind this presentation at any point. First, let's define what we mean when we say vulnerable groups. Our definition of vulnerable groups is based on a number of criteria. Our primary criterion is that these are people who are vulnerable from the standpoint of digital skills. So although participants may face different challenges and be classed as vulnerable for different reasons, the question we are focusing on here is that of their digital skills. But there is no need to reinvent the wheel. Digital skills may be relevant to groups of people you are already in contact with. For example, particular groups for whom you already provide services and/or targeted outreach, target groups of partner organisations or venues, and individuals and/or groups who have requested support from you. So don't hesitate to build on things you've already done when organising workshops. You don't have to start from scratch. When we talk about vulnerable groups, many people reference the so-called traditional categories, which are based on gender, age, or socioeconomic status. However, these categories can often be reductive, even stigmatising, and it should be highlighted that people often face a number of interlocking difficulties. So these categories often overlap and interact with each other. In your digital skills workshops, it's important to aim for a logic of inclusion rather than segregation. So we think that a more fruitful question is to ask ourselves what barriers people may face, rather than what categories do these people fall into. These are barriers that people may encounter, which are made harder due to their lack of digital skills. So, what are the concrete needs that people may have? Looked at in this way, it's possible to see that people who are perhaps labelled under different groups in the traditional categories actually encounter the same obstacles and can gain much from working together. So what are these obstacles and barriers? Now, of course, above all, there is the question of access to digital technology. Some people may have difficulty accessing digital equipment. They may not have access to a good internet connection, or they may not have appropriately adapted equipment for their disability. However, once you remove these barriers to access, the main aim of your digital skills workshops is improving digital skills. In this regard, we must bear in mind that the learning process may itself face barriers, influenced by other factors such as language difficulties or low levels of education. There is also another important dimension to consider when working with the so-called vulnerable groups: psychological barriers. As we have already said, many of these groups face multiple difficulties, and some individuals may face psychological barriers. These may include a negative perception of their own skills, low levels of self-confidence, or difficulties maintaining motivation when they are faced with multiple obstacles in life. And we could also add to this a fear of damaging equipment or a fear of making mistakes. All of this plays a huge role in the possibility of developing digital skills, and so it's really important to take into account these psychological barriers. The list of barriers we have just described is not exhaustive. So, if you wish, please pause the video here and, based on your own knowledge and your experiences, consider what other barriers individuals or groups may face, and which barriers particularly affect your target groups. So, how can you best adapt your practice to work with vulnerable groups? There are two main questions to ask here. The first is a question of needs. By considering the question of what do your workshop participants need, you'll be able to work out the best skills to work on with your workshop participants, the most appropriate examples to use during your sessions, which exercises to choose for your participants, and how you can best link the topics you cover to real-life scenarios. And then the second question is how you can help people overcome the barriers they face. Thus, how can you organise your workshops and interact with participants to help remove these barriers? Let's turn to the needs analysis first. The more you analyse the needs of participants, the better you will be able to understand your context and requirements, as well as what can cause obstacles and how to adapt to these. You will also be able to generate more interest and motivation from participants. So really, the more you analyse the needs of participants, the better you will be able to meet your own objectives. To analyse the needs of your participants, you should refer to the knowledge you may already have of the specific vulnerable group. However, if this is simply an idea of the group, based on little prior experience, you will need to pay attention to your own preconceptions, which may influence your view of the vulnerable group that you intend to work with. If you have the opportunity to work with or simply be in contact with partner organisations who have experience of working with particular vulnerable groups, don't hesitate to ask them for further information. Consider the current context in which the vulnerable groups live, which affects their ability to participate in workshops and the ways in which they can participate. And of course, above all, talk to your participants to understand their needs. You don't necessarily need to use questionnaires, which may be difficult for some workshop participants to fill out. Simply by talking directly to them, you can find out more about their specific needs. Once you have linked the needs identified to skills to be acquired, it is worth remembering that all the digital skills you may cover are found in the DigComp 2.1 framework. The Digital Traveller's Library of Resources is organised around the DigComp 2.1, and by using this library, you can find a whole series of resources to help you structure workshops for your participants. To find out more about the DigComp 2.1 and how the Digital Traveller's Library of Resources is organised, you can watch the modules entitled What is DigComp 2.1 and the Digital Traveller's Library of Resources. Now let's turn to the second question, helping people overcome the barriers they face. Our approach to working with vulnerable groups is to try to keep things simple, but just because we want to keep things simple doesn't mean we're going to be simplistic. It is true that our approach is based on developing participants' functional skills, starting with very practical, basic skills, and progressively introducing new skills in a very concrete way. The acronym you see here, BYOD, Bring Your Own Device, refers to the fact that, if they have their own device, as much as possible, you should encourage participants to learn using their own equipment. However, even if we focus our attention on these functional skills, it's important to remember what underlies these workshops is an attempt to encourage participants to develop their own critical thinking and to reflect on their own practice. This may seem a little complicated, but it is essential to allow participants to develop autonomy. So while learning things that are very practical, very concrete, very functional from the outset, you want to encourage participants to also take a step back from what they're doing and critique the situation. So, for example, we want participants to develop the skills to inspect critically what they come across online. This relates to the question of fake news, for example. Remember, our vulnerable groups are also vulnerable because they have not necessarily had the chance to develop a critical view of what they come across in the digital sphere, and that's where you can help. There is obviously another essential aspect of our approach, which relates to e-security. It is vital that this topic of e-security is not forgotten about from the outset. And then, of course, we get into things that are perhaps a little more familiar. You're going to help participants to look for information and to select it in a way that allows them to make mistakes. If you want to help participants to develop autonomy and to dare to do things on their own, it's important to create an environment where it is possible to explore, to make mistakes, to give things a go. Sometimes things will work and sometimes they won't. And as a facilitator, it's important to remember that you will also make mistakes, and there is no shame in that. On the contrary, it's more likely to reassure your participants, as they will understand that they are not the only ones who sometimes make mistakes, and that no mistake is insurmountable. The learning environment that you create needs to be based on a great level of mutual understanding, both in terms of the difficulties that each participant may face, but also in terms of cultural and social differences. So creating a caring and mutually enriching context, which makes people feel reassured, is key here. And reassurance is perhaps the watchword in relation to working with vulnerable groups. When your participants feel reassured, they will be better placed to discover new skills. Communication is also essential and is linked to this idea of mutual understanding. It's also important to note that the development of digital skills can also enable the development of general communication skills, and for your vulnerable target groups, this is not insignificant. It is therefore an added benefit of the workshops and activities that you can offer them. And finally, it is important to remember that digital technology offers a lot in terms of creativity and collaboration. Indeed, digital skills should not be exclusive and accessible only to those who have already developed necessary skills in other areas. From the start, it is good to integrate a notion of creativity and collaboration into workshops, because they will add meaning to the learning and will also inject some fun into your workshops. It will also make it possible to tackle several different skills through the same task. Working on exercises together will encourage collaboration between participants and reinforce feelings of belonging and self-confidence. It may also allow participants to see that their own questions are the same as somebody else's. Returning to the psychological barriers we talked about earlier, it's important not to underestimate these factors, and you shouldn't hesitate to create activities that allow people to work together, even if they go on to work on things on their own later. So, in the end, the points to pay attention to when it comes to facilitating workshops relate far more to developing relationships and positive attitudes than to the idea of expertise. It is good to think here about the role of the facilitator that we discuss in the self-training module entitled My Role as a Facilitator. To recap, here are some facilitation points which are essential to consider. Observe people without preconceived ideas, avoid judgments, and really listen to their needs. Behave in a way that shows that you are interested. Let information flow naturally, and avoid hasty judgments or conclusions. Ensure mutual understanding. Use common vocabulary, ask open-ended questions to go further, and reformulate and verify participants' understanding. That is to say, think about rephrasing questions and responses, checking that everyone understands, and as we've mentioned before, taking into account potential obstacles to learning, such as language difficulties. Also, prioritise activities that are concrete and immediately useful, for example, by identifying situations where digital skills are vital. Promote confidence and positive self-esteem. Select activities that will help participants to develop confidence and positive self-esteem, point out existing skills, and highlight progress made. And finally, create a sense of belonging and a secure learning environment. Encourage a positive group dynamic, and destigmatize wherever possible. All these points are key when you are working with vulnerable groups, arguably more so than simply technical questions. If you wish to, please pause this video here to consider the following questions. Based on your knowledge and your experiences, can you think of other facilitation techniques which are useful in overcoming barriers? And can you think of other further things to bear in mind when facilitating workshops with vulnerable groups? So now let's turn to the topic of reaching vulnerable groups and the important question of whether there are any specific things to take into account due to the fact that you're trying to reach vulnerable and digitally excluded people. In the first instance, you will need to publicise the services and workshops that you are offering. It is good to think about the means through which you will contact people. Notably, think about communicating via various channels, making yourself known in places frequented by your target groups, and as we have already said, collaborating with organisations where your vulnerable audience feels at ease already. And if possible, going through people who have already participated in these types of activities themselves. These individuals can be excellent ambassadors for your services. Based on your context, can you think of other ways to publicise your services? Please feel free to pause the video here and consider this question for a few moments. It is also important to consider the manner in which you are going to contact people. Try to provide simple and precise information. Highlight the potential concrete benefits of your proposed activities. Ensure you make contact in a friendly and pleasant way. Favour relaxed encounters and advertise workshops in a way that makes them sound appealing. Where possible, also demonstrate that you can take into account the organisational constraints of your vulnerable groups, such as the fact that they may have to take care of their children or relatives, or have particular working hours. In general, it can be good to opt for short workshops rather than long training courses, which can prove simpler and more attractive, especially when people want to get to know what you can offer. If you wish to do so, please pause the video here and consider this question. Based on your knowledge and understanding of your target groups, can you think of other further points to highlight when advertising your workshops? For many reasons, you may not always be able to reach out to your vulnerable groups through the normal means or in person, for example, because of weather conditions or a public health crisis. In these cases, there are some other points to consider in terms of the means of communication. You might want to advertise in places that are a little unusual, but which are still frequented in these circumstances, such as shops. You could find out about existing Facebook and WhatsApp groups that already reach vulnerable groups. Don't hesitate to use video clips, even if they're not very complex or polished. A short video can present what you offer in a more fun way. Can you think of other ways to reach individuals or groups if you cannot meet them in person? Please pause the video here, if you wish to take a few moments to think about this question. When adapting your means of communication to your specific circumstances, it is also worth considering the following elements about the manner and the content of the communication. Highlight the particular importance of improving digital skills given the specific context, whatever that may be, which requires them to use digital technology for a whole series of things. Take into account family demands, so the fact that within a vulnerable family, there may be children at home, or indeed several people within the household who have complex needs. Families may also have only a limited number of devices. Develop a mentoring system to best accompany people at a distance. Could you contact participants by telephone and/or via a friend or relative who is more digitally skilled? And then finally, reassure your vulnerable groups that there are alternatives if they struggle or have little access to devices, and that these issues shouldn't be barriers to taking part. In the practical guidance section, there are resources about organising and facilitating workshops online, which you may find useful if you cannot meet in person. So, very quickly, what practical use is this module to you when reaching out to and interacting with vulnerable groups? It can help you to find new, innovative ways to contact vulnerable groups. It is not always necessary to meet in person to advertise your workshops. It can help you to reflect on how you approach vulnerable groups. You can better interact and communicate with vulnerable groups and build positive relationships. It can help you to recognise the common challenges faced by multiple vulnerable target groups. Different groups of people may face similar barriers, such as access to technology and psychological barriers. It shows you how to recognise and adapt to the specific circumstances of participants. Individuals may face challenges of limited devices, family responsibilities, or specific working hours. This is the end of the Working with Vulnerable Groups self-training module. We recommend that you continue your training journey by completing further training modules, such as the Digital Traveller's Library of Resources, My Role as a Facilitator, or the Stages in a Workshop, if you have not already done so. If you have already completed the 6 training modules, you can extend the breadth and the depth of your knowledge by exploring our practical guidance section, which includes an FAQ, do's and don'ts, and an additional practical guide about how to reach and interact with specific audiences, which builds on this module's content. Finally, if you would like to learn more about the content of this module, please take a look at the image and module sources on this slide.